am Victoria Moore, and I was 32 the night my mother smiled while my sister announced she was pregnant with my fiancé's baby at my own engagement party. But this story really starts in the silence right after that announcement, when I realized the betrayal had been scheduled on my dime. My whole life, I was the reliable wallet. My sister Harper was the delicate one who needed funding. That night, I finally stopped paying the bill. What I did in the months following that party, and the forensic paper trail I built to dismantle a crime, is the part none of them ever saw coming. Welcome back to Revenge Order, where ordinary people use cold facts to settle the score. If a story like this finds you tonight, drop a comment with your age and subscribe so the next one reaches you, too. The air in the Lexington Country Club smelled of roasted prime rib and white lilies. I had signed the catering check 2 weeks prior using my annual bonus from the auditing firm. Every floral arrangement, every folded linen napkin, every crystal water glass belonged to a spreadsheet I had meticulously balanced. I sat at the center table wearing a silk dress I had spent 3 months choosing. Across the room, my sister Harper stood on the low mahogany stage. Her manicured fingers gripped a wireless microphone. She wore a fitted emerald maternity dress. I recognized the cut of the fabric. I had seen a charge for a boutique maternity brand on my joint bank statement last month. Julian had told me it was a gift for a coworker. "I am 4 months pregnant," she said into the microphone. Her voice carried a practiced, breathless quality. She placed her free hand over the flat fabric at her waist. "With Julian's baby." She looked down at the man standing beside the stage. Julian was my fiancé of 14 months. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the oak floorboards. His fingers pulled at the collar of his custom suit, another item I had funded. A heavy flush crept up his neck, spreading into his jawline. He looked like a man waiting for a storm to pass so he could seek shelter. He let Harper hold the microphone because he lacked the spine to hold it himself. A waiter dropped a silver tray near the kitchen doors. The metal clattered against the tile. That was the only sound in a room of 60 guests. Nobody spoke. 60 faces turned toward my table, waiting for a reaction. They expected the betrayed woman to throw a wine glass or collapse into a sobbing heap of ruined tulle. They wanted a show. I am a corporate compliance auditor. My brain processes catastrophe as raw data. I do not panic. I quantify. Instead of staring at the man who had just dismantled our future, I scanned the sea of frozen faces. I bypassed the shocked cousins and the gasping aunts. I locked onto the one person who orchestrated the weather in our family. My mother Diane sat at the head table, flanked by her country club peers. Her hands rested neatly in her lap. She was not gasping. She was not clutching her chest. Her lips curved into a serene, fixed smile. As the silence stretched, Diane reached across her wrist to adjust a piece of jewelry. The chandelier light caught the silver metal. It was a charm bracelet, a heavy, custom-engraved piece dangling a single, prominent word. Grandma. A coldness settled in my chest, pushing out the oxygen. This was not a sudden drunken confession born out of guilt. This was a scheduled event. My mother had known. Julian had known. Harper had known. They had purchased commemorative jewelry for it. They chose my engagement party to drop the blade. The calculation was obvious to anyone who understood the unwritten rules of our family. Ambush Victoria in public, rely on her rigid Kentucky manners and her lifelong conditioning as the reliable one, pin her under the weight of staring guests, forcing her to swallow the betrayal gracefully. Diane wanted Harper's new family to bloom without the stain of a messy scene. She expected me to nod, offer a tight smile, and fade into the background. My entire life had been a stage built to support my sister's lighting. When Harper wrecked her car at 20, I bought her a used sedan so she could get to class. When she quit 3 jobs in 1 year, I paid her rent. Diane always framed these extractions as compliments. "Victoria, you are so capable. Harper is delicate. She needs a softer landing." Tonight was just the grand finale of a lifelong performance. They needed a house and a stable income for a baby. They decided my life was the most convenient asset to seize. I picked up my crystal flute. The carbonation rose in a steady stream. I looked at my left hand. I slid the 2-carat diamond off my finger. The metal dragged against my knuckle, leaving a faint red mark. I held the ring over the rim of the glass and let it go. It sank through the pale liquid and settled at the bottom. The cut of the stone looked warped through the curved glass. A fitting lens for the evening. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs glided smoothly over the carpet. I planned to turn my back on them and walk out the mahogany doors, leaving Diane and Harper to manage their own manufactured storm. I would not give them the screaming match they needed to cast me as the bitter villain. But before I could take a single step, the heavy scrape of wood against wood echoed from the table to my right. A man stood up. He bypassed the polite silence entirely. He was 78 years old. His hands bore the calluses of 50 years running a horse farm. He wore a simple dark suit that contrasted with the tuxedos around him. He was the only person in Lexington my mother feared. My grandfather Harrison squared his shoulders. He looked directly at the stage. The room held its breath. He opened his mouth to speak. Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In a room full of people desperate to prove their status, my grandfather was the only man who knew exactly what he was worth. He owned 150 acres of prime Kentucky bluegrass just outside the city limits. He built his farm from the dirt up with calloused hands and quiet discipline. Diane spent her entire adult life running from the scent of that farm, desperate to scrub the soil from her lineage and replace it with country club memberships and designer labels. She feared Harrison because he saw straight through the veneer. He always had. He stood tall, his posture straight, despite his 78 years. His dark suit was practical, not tailored like the velvet jackets surrounding him. He looked at the low stage. Harper had summoned a few theatrical tears for her audience, dabbing the corner of her eye with a manicured finger. Harrison did not buy a single drop of it. He shifted his gaze to Julian, who flinched under the weight of the old man's stare. Finally, Harrison looked down at his daughter. Diane sat frozen at the head table, her hand still hovering near the engraved charm bracelet on her wrist. Harrison leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the white linen tablecloth. He spoke evenly. His tone carried the flat, unforgiving weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. You just lost it all. 5 words. He did not elaborate. He did not yell. He did not wait for a response or a defense or a counterargument. He simply turned his back on the entire room, walked down the center aisle, and pushed through the heavy mahogany double doors. The silence he left behind was suffocating. Diane's fixed smile wavered, the corners pulling down into something brittle and panicked. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin the narrative back into her control, but I did not give her the chance. I took my cue. I stepped away from the table, leaving my champagne glass and the sinking diamond behind. I kept my spine straight and my chin level. I walked the exact same path my grandfather had taken. The fabric of my silk dress rustled against the carpet. I felt the heat of 60 stairs burning into my shoulder blades, but I did not look back. Giving them a hysterical reaction would only hand them the ammunition they needed to call me crazy. My silence was a wall they could not climb. The cool autumn air of the parking lot hit my face the moment the doors closed behind me. The crisp Kentucky night smelled of fallen leaves and expensive valet exhaust. The contrast to the suffocating floral heat of the ballroom cleared my head instantly. Harrison was standing beside his heavy-duty pickup truck. He had not started the engine. He stood under the amber glow of a street lamp, waiting for me. I walked over to him, my heels clicking against the asphalt. My hands were shaking just a little, a slight tremor in my fingers as the adrenaline spiked through my veins. Harrison reached out and covered my trembling hands with his warm, rough palms. He did not offer me pity. Pity was useless currency on a working farm, and he knew I did not want it. He looked me in the eye. "Do not shed a single tear for a man you just outgrew," he said. His voice was gravelly, but gentle. "You shed tears for things of value, Victoria. That boy in there has none. I nodded, swallowing the tight knot in my throat. I squeezed his hands, once stepped back, and walked to my own car. I unlocked the sedan, slid into the leather driver's seat, and pressed the ignition button. The dashboard illuminated, displaying the time. 8:42 in the evening. In less than an hour, my entire future had been dismantled and repackaged for my sister. I pulled out of the country club parking lot, merging onto the dark stretch of New Circle Road. The hum of the tires against the pavement provided a steady rhythm as my brain shifted from shock into full analytical mode. I am an auditor. I follow the paper trail. As I drove, I began to audit my own life, tracing the long pattern of extraction that led to this exact night. I had always been the reliable wallet. In my family, love was not a given, right? It was a transactional reward for paying the bills. Whenever a crisis struck, Diane's first phone call was always to me. When Harper maxed out 3 credit cards during her sophomore year of college, Diane called me in tears, claiming the stress was going to ruin Harper's delicate health. I drained my early savings to clear the debt. When Harper totaled her sedan because she was texting while driving, I co-signed the loan for her replacement vehicle. Diane always dressed the extortion in the language of empowerment. You are the strong one, Victoria. You are so independent. You can handle anything. For years, I wore the title of the strong one, like a badge of honor. It took me a decade to realize it was not a compliment. It was a tax. It was a convenient label Diane used to justify stripping me of my resources to pad Harper's soft landing. The strong one simply meant the one we do not have to care for, the one who will absorb the cost, the one whose boundaries we can ignore because she will never complain. Julian had seamlessly adopted that same vocabulary. When we started dating, he admired my career drive. Over the past 14 months, that admiration evolved into a comfortable reliance. I paid for the dinners. I booked the vacations. I funded the joint wedding account with my bonuses, while he contributed vague promises about his upcoming commission checks that never seemed to clear. I had been funding my own deception month by month, dollar by dollar. I flipped on my turn signal, steering into my upscale neighborhood. The street lamps cast long shadows over the manicured lawns. I approached my townhouse. It was a beautiful 3-bedroom brick property I had closed on 8 months ago. I paid the down payment entirely out of my own investment yields. Julian had manipulated his way onto the mortgage paperwork at the very last minute, arguing that being on the deed was a symbolic gesture of our future union. I ignored my own compliance training and signed the document. It was the most expensive emotional compromise of my life. I pulled into my driveway and shifted the car into park. The engine cut off, plunging the cabin into silence. I looked up through the windshield. The porch light was glowing. Julian's silver sedan was parked in its usual spot near the garage. Parked directly behind him, blocking the driveway at an illegal angle, was Harper's compact car. They had beaten me here. They skipped the rest of the engagement party and drove straight to my address. I stepped out of my car. The chill in the air felt sharper now, biting through the thin silk of my dress. I walked up the concrete steps to the front door. I slid my brass key into the deadbolt. The lock turned with a heavy metallic click. I pushed the door open, stepping into the foyer. The entryway smelled distinctly of vanilla and rosewater, Harper's signature perfume. I stood perfectly still in the foyer, listening to the sounds echoing from the top of the stairs. I expected to hear hurried footsteps. I expected Julian to be frantically packing a duffel bag, ready to beg for forgiveness or flee into the night. I expected the frantic energy of guilty people trying to escape the scene of the crime. Instead, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thump of rolling luggage wheels gliding across the hardwood floor of the upstairs hallway. I heard the sharp zip of a canvas suitcase opening. Then came the soft murmur of casual conversation, followed by a short, breathy laugh. Harper's laugh. The sound drifted down the staircase, floating right past the framed photos of Julian and me hanging on the wall. They were not packing to leave. They were unpacking to stay. I looked at the polished wooden steps leading up to the master bedroom, realizing with absolute clarity that I was no longer dealing with a broken engagement. I was walking into a hostile occupation. I placed my hand on the wooden banister. The polished oak felt cold against my palm. I climbed the stairs slowly. Each step produced a familiar, soft creak. I knew the sounds of this house intimately because I had paid a private inspector to evaluate every square inch of it before signing the closing documents 8 months ago. Now those familiar sounds heralded an invasion. I reached the second-floor landing. The master bedroom door stood wide open. Warm yellow light spilled into the hallway, illuminating the framed photographs Julian and I had hung just last month. I stepped into the doorway. Harper had placed her oversized leather suitcase directly on top of my white linen duvet cover. The wheels of her luggage were tracking parking lot dirt across the fabric. She stood in front of my walk-in closet, holding a thick stack of my cashmere sweaters in her arms. She was not folding them. She was dropping them onto the floor in a careless pile to make room for her own clothes. Julian stood near the window with his hands tucked deep into his trouser pockets. He watched her rearrange my closet with the passive, detached expression of a man waiting in a dentist's reception area. Neither of them noticed me at first. I stood in the doorframe studying the scene. It looked like a photograph of a burglary in progress, captured in high definition. Victoria. Julian saw me first. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and took a half step forward before freezing in place. His voice carried a soft, negotiating tone. He sounded like a crisis mediator dealing with a volatile suspect on a ledge. Harper spun around. She dropped a velvet clothing hanger. It clattered sharply against the hardwood floor. She immediately placed her hand over her stomach, adopting a protective, exaggerated posture. "We did not think you would come back tonight," Harper said. Her voice dripped with a practiced, breathy empathy. She sounded like a lifestyle influencer delivering a rehearsed script on wellness and forgiveness. "This is my house," I said. My voice remained level. I did not raise the volume by a single decibel. Harper sighed deeply. She looked at Julian as if seeking backup from a silent business partner. Julian cleared his throat. "We all need to navigate this transition carefully," Julian said. His eyes shifted away from my face, fixing on a point just above my left shoulder. "The baby needs a stable environment, Victoria. Harper is high risk right now. The stress of moving her into a new apartment is just not feasible. We figured since you travel so much for the auditing firm, you could take the guest room down the hall. It gets great morning light. Let us just be adults about this." I stared at him. He was attempting to relegate me to the spare room of the property I had purchased so his new family could occupy the master suite. He framed the eviction as a logical compromise. "We are trying to prioritize healing," Harper added. She took a step closer, wrapping both arms around her waist. "We want to support family, Victoria. Holding on to anger will only create a toxic space for the baby. We need to cohabitate as adults and move forward." They had armed themselves with weaponized therapy speak. They twisted clinical words like boundaries and healing and toxic to form a shield around their own betrayal. If I yelled, I would be the toxic element. If I demanded a pregnant woman leave the premises, I would be the villain, denying a safe environment. They had engineered a psychological trap where my only polite option was total surrender. I looked at my sweaters piled on the floor. I looked at the man who had kissed my cheek that very morning. I did not scream. Screaming implies a loss of emotional control, and I needed every ounce of my cognitive function. I turned my back on them and walked out of the room. I heard Julian exhale a loud breath of relief, assuming my silence indicated compliance. I walked downstairs into the kitchen. The granite countertops gleamed under the recessed lighting. I needed a glass of cold water to clear the dry taste in my mouth. I walked toward the refrigerator, but stopped halfway across the tile floor. Julian's laptop sat open on the kitchen island. The screen glowed brightly in the dim room. He had disabled the automatic sleep mode. I stepped closer. I am an auditor. I read digital screens the way other people read facial expressions. The internet browser displayed an open email tab. The sender was Vanguard. The subject line read, "Password reset request." My pulse slowed to a cold, steady rhythm. Vanguard was a brokerage firm where I held my primary investment accounts. Those accounts contained my emergency fund, my stock portfolio, and the down payment savings I had rebuilt after closing on this townhouse. Julian had not come straight home to unpack Harper's maternity clothes. He had come home to breach my financial perimeter. He knew I was distracted at the country club. He calculated that a woman weeping over a broken engagement would not be checking her email alerts. He was attempting to route my investment funds into a joint account before I had the presence of mind to lock him out. This was not just a cheating scandal. This was a heist. He wanted the house. He wanted the savings. He wanted the infrastructure of the life I had built to fund the life he had created behind my back. I realized in that exact second that standing my ground in the townhouse was a strategic error. Fighting over closet space with a pregnant woman was a pointless distraction. If I stayed in this house, I would be sleeping under the same roof as a man actively trying to drain my net worth. I needed a secure perimeter. Retreating was not a sign of weakness. It was a tactical relocation. I bypassed the refrigerator and walked straight into my home office. I closed the heavy oak door and locked the deadbolt. I pulled my encrypted work laptop from the docking station and shoved it into my leather tote bag. I crouched down and spun the brass dial on my fireproof floor safe. I extracted every hard copy financial file, the physical deed to the townhouse, my birth certificate, and my passport. I stacked the thick manila folders into the tote. I grabbed my spare set of car keys and a small toiletry bag from the hallway closet. I walked back into the foyer. I could hear Harper upstairs humming a soft, cheerful tune while she arranged her shoes in my closet. She was already playing house. I opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp night. I let the door click shut behind me, leaving them the physical structure for now. Bricks and drywall could be recovered through legal channels. My liquid assets required immediate digital defense. I drove 10 miles across Lexington to an extended stay hotel near the interstate. I requested a room on the top floor at the end of the hallway, paying in cash to avoid leaving a location footprint on my credit card statement. The hotel room smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee. The decor was sparse and uninviting. A generic floral print hung above a stiff queen bed. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen, because it was entirely empty. It was a blank slate. I dropped my leather tote onto the small laminate desk in the corner. I did not take off my silk dress. I did not wash my makeup off. I pulled the desk chair out and sat down. I reached into the bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I flipped the screen open. The blue light washed over my face, illuminating the dark room. The emotional shock of the evening evaporated. The sting of the public humiliation, the image of Harper rubbing her stomach, the sound of Julian's negotiating voice, all of it faded into a dull background noise. Forensic detachment took over. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I needed to trace every dollar. I needed to know the exact depth of the rot. I logged into my banking portal, bypassing Julian's clumsy reset attempts, and locked the accounts down with dual-factor authentication. I stared at the glowing rows of transactions. I prepared to dig into the past 14 months of my life. I asked myself the only question that mattered now. Exactly how long have I been paying for my own replacement? The laminate surface of the hotel desk was cold under my wrists. The digital clock on the bedside table read 11:14. The industrial air conditioning unit in the corner hummed a steady monotone, masking the sound of the interstate traffic outside. I sat in the stiff fabric chair staring at the login screen of the joint banking portal. In my profession, we refer to this phase as the discovery sweep. You do not look for a specific crime. You pull the raw data, you format the columns, and you let the anomalies present themselves. Numbers lack the capacity to lie. They do not wear custom jewelry or practice breathy apologies. They just sit in their designated cells, waiting to be read. I typed my credentials into the portal and bypassed the standard security prompts. I navigated to the transaction history for the checking and savings accounts Julian and I shared. I selected the date range spanning the last 14 months. the exact duration of our engagement. I clicked Export. A raw CSV file downloaded to my encrypted hard drive. I opened the file and began organizing the chaos. I expanded the columns, adjusting the margins for the merchant names, the transaction dates, and the withdrawal amounts. I applied a filter to sort the data not by chronological order, but by highest expenditure. My eyes scanned the top rows. The mortgage payments were expected. The property tax installments were normal. Then a singular, isolated charge caught my attention: $450. The merchant listed was Hatch and Haven, a luxury maternity boutique located in a high-end retail district across town. The transaction date was logged exactly 3 weeks ago. I stared at the black text against the glaring white background. I traced the date with my cursor. 3 weeks ago, Julian and I were standing in the kitchen of the townhouse. I had been holding a brochure for a bridal salon, discussing the deposit required for a Vera Wang gown I had fallen in love with. I remembered the exact weight of his hands resting on my shoulders. I remembered the earnest, practiced tone of his voice as he kissed the side of my head. "Let us hold off on the dress deposit for just another month," he had said. "We need to keep our liquid cash open for the honeymoon bookings. I want to spoil you in Bora Bora, Victoria. I want everything to be perfect. You deserve it." I had agreed. I had transferred my bonus into the joint savings account to ensure our travel fund remained healthy. I had compromised on my own wedding dress under the illusion of building our shared future. The spreadsheet laid out the reality of that transaction. Julian did not redirect those funds to save for a tropical honeymoon. He redirected my paycheck to purchase the fitted emerald silk dress Harper wore tonight to announce her pregnancy. He had financed the costume for my own public execution using the money I earned. I clicked the cell containing the $450 charge. I changed the highlight color to a vivid, stark red. Suddenly, the spreadsheet minimized. The browser window containing the banking portal snapped to the front of my screen. A gray error box appeared in the center of the display. "Session terminated. Another user has logged in from a recognized device." Julian was awake. He was sitting in my townhouse, likely staring at the glowing screen on the kitchen island, realizing his initial password reset attempt on my investment account had failed. Now he was pivoting his strategy. He was logging into our shared checking portal, attempting to drain the liquid cash before I could secure it. It was a clumsy, predictable maneuver, a digital smash and grab. He initiated a transfer request, attempting to wire the entire joint balance to an external routing number. I watched the pending transaction pop up in the pending queue. He was typing fast, rushing through the prompts. He forgot one crucial detail. I am the primary account holder. I built the security architecture for our shared finances. I did not panic. I opened a secondary terminal window and accessed the administrative dashboard of the bank. I triggered the fraud protocol override. The system required a biometric confirmation. I pressed my thumb to the scanner on my laptop keyboard. The security token glowed green. I intercepted his wire transfer mid-cycle and canceled the request. The pending charge vanished from the ledger. Next, I navigated to the authorized user settings. Julian had enjoyed unrestricted access to this account for over a year. I located his profile, his phone number, his email address, and his saved device IP addresses. I clicked the Removal tab. The system asked for a confirmation reason. I selected Suspected Fraud from the drop-down menu. I hit Enter. In a fraction of a second, Julian's access was revoked. His debit card was deactivated. His saved login credentials were burned. I imagine him sitting in my kitchen watching his screen go blank, staring at the Access Denied prompt, wondering how a locked door had just materialized in front of him. To ensure the perimeter was impenetrable, I initiated an internal sweep of the funds. I moved the entire balance of the joint account safely into an escrow holding account registered solely under my Social Security number. The shared ledger hit 0. The digital skirmish lasted less than 4 minutes. I won without ever raising my heart rate. I closed the banking portal and returned to the spreadsheet. The threat was neutralized. It was time to map the rest of the infection. I applied a new pivot table, searching for recurring patterns. I color-coded every discrepancy. The story of their affair unfolded in chronological order, row by row. I found a recurring $60 charge at a specialized holistic pharmacy on the south side of Lexington. The transactions occurred every 3 weeks. Prenatal vitamins. Julian had been purchasing my sister's folic acid supplements while I worked late shifts at the auditing firm. I cross-referenced his supposed business trips. In October, he claimed to be attending a regional sales conference in Cincinnati. The ledger showed a $300 charge for a bed and breakfast in the Kentucky Hills. The date aligned perfectly with a weekend Harper told Diane she was attending a silent yoga retreat to manage her anxiety. There were dinner receipts from secluded steakhouses on the outskirts of the county. There were gas station charges in towns neither Julian nor I had any reason to visit. I highlighted cell after cell. The screen turned into a vibrant mosaic of theft. Red for the clothes, yellow for the vitamins, blue for the hotel rooms. The betrayal lost its emotional sting. It was no longer a devastating heartbreak. It was a quantifiable metric. Julian and Harper were not star-crossed lovers swept away by an undeniable passion. They were financial parasites. They had constructed an entire parallel existence funded by my direct deposits. I leaned back in the stiff hotel chair. The muscles in my neck ached. The digital clock now read 1 a.m. The initial audit was complete. I had secured the liquid cash and documented the marital fraud. I closed the spreadsheet program and prepared to shut the laptop down for the night. I needed sleep to handle the inevitable legal warfare the morning would bring. As my cursor moved toward the shutdown icon, a small white notification box slid into the top right corner of my display screen. It was an automated alert from my encrypted credit monitoring service. The software monitors my Social Security number for any unauthorized inquiries across the 3 major bureaus. The text in the notification box was bold and urgent. New hard inquiry detected. I stopped breathing. A hard inquiry only occurs when an individual formally applies for a new line of credit, a mortgage, or a vehicle loan. I had not applied for a single financial product in 8 months. I clicked the notification. The secure dashboard loaded, rendering the details of the inquiry. This was not a ping on the joint checking account I had just locked down. This had nothing to do with the shared savings. The inquiry was directed exclusively at my personal credit profile. Someone had just submitted an application for a $50,000 home equity line of credit. The collateral listed on the application was the brick townhouse I had left 3 hours ago, the townhouse where Julian and Harper were currently sleeping. They were not just trying to steal the cash in the checking account. They were actively attempting to leverage the equity of my home to extract a small fortune in my name. I watched the cursor blink next to the $50,000 figure. The hotel room remained perfectly still, but the digital alert on my screen signaled a breach that required immediate action. Julian was not just a coward seeking a soft exit. He was a predator looking for a severance package. A home equity line of credit requires a thorough underwriting process. It requires income verification, and most importantly, it requires the explicit consent of the primary property owner. I was the sole name on the property deed. Julian had merely manipulated his way onto the mortgage paperwork. To initiate a draw of that size, he would need my signature. Before I could dig into the routing data of the credit application, my cell phone began to vibrate. The device buzzed steadily against the laminate desk, moving in slow increments across the cheap wood grain. I glanced at the screen. The sun was just beginning to break over the interstate, casting a pale gray light through the hotel window. It was 6 a.m. The notifications were not coming from Julian or Harper. They were flooding in from the family group chat. I unlocked the phone. Diane had not wasted a single hour. While I was tracking a financial hemorrhage, she was busy constructing a public relations campaign. Diane had published a lengthy post on her social media page, tagging 50 of our relatives and country club acquaintances. I read the paragraphs with the same detached scrutiny I applied to my audit reports. She titled the post, a season of unexpected blessings. She did not mention the engagement party ambush. She did not mention the ring at the bottom of the champagne glass. Instead, Diane spun a masterful narrative of star-crossed destiny. She described Harper as a fragile soul who had finally found a safe harbor. She framed the pregnancy as a miracle that brought two meant-to-be hearts together. Then came the calculated character assassination directed at me. Diane wrote that sometimes people are better suited for boardrooms than living rooms. She claimed Julian had been starving for warmth and traditional family values, things my demanding corporate career could never provide. She painted me as a cold, calculating machine who cared more about compliance regulations than domestic bliss. She asked for privacy and grace for the new couple as they navigated this beautiful, complex transition. The comments beneath the post were a parade of enablers. My phone chimed again. A text message from my Aunt Susan appeared on the screen. "We are all praying for you, Victoria. This is a difficult trial, but you have always been the bigger person. Family forgives. Harper needs a stress-free environment right now. Do not hold on to bitterness." Another message arrived from a cousin. "Just saw your mom's post. So crazy. You are strong, though. You will bounce back and focus on your promotion. Let them have this." I set the phone down. They were deploying the old vocabulary. Be the bigger person. Family forgives. You are strong. They expected me to read these platitudes and quietly step aside. They wanted me to surrender my dignity, my fiancé, and my house to maintain the fragile aesthetic of Diane's social circle. I looked back at the glowing laptop screen displaying the $50,000 credit inquiry. The contrast between Diane's romanticized fiction and the cold, hard reality of federal wire fraud was striking. They were asking for grace, while Julian was actively attempting to forge my name on bank documents. My mind snagged on a specific detail. A fraud of this magnitude requires a certain level of comfort with deception. Julian was acting with the speed and confidence of a man who had done this before. I stared at the white wall of the hotel room, tracing a memory from a year ago. Julian and I were sitting in the living room of my previous apartment. He was pacing the floor, holding a printed credit report. He was putting on a theatrical display of outrage. He claimed a mysterious inquiry had tanked his credit score by 80 points. He blamed dark web identity thieves and compromised retail databases. I had told him to file a formal police report and freeze his social security number. He brushed off my advice, claiming the bureaucratic hassle was not worth his time. He promised he would handle it quietly through a credit repair agency. I realized now he was never the victim of identity theft. He was testing the waters. He was covering up a hidden financial indiscretion, establishing a baseline narrative. He groomed me to accept sudden credit anomalies as external attacks rather than internal betrayals. He was a seasoned financial parasite, and I had invited him into the host organism. I picked up my phone and muted the family group chat. I turned off the notifications for all social media applications. I did not type a single defense. I did not argue with Aunt Susan or correct my cousin's assumptions. Responding to the spin campaign would only validate their drama. It would pull me into an emotional mud pit where Diane held the home field advantage. I returned my hands to the keyboard. I had a credit ping to trace. I cross-referenced the inquiry code with the National Lender Database. The application did not originate from a faceless online entity. It traced back to a specific regional bank located in downtown Lexington. It was a brick-and-mortar institution known for expediting local real estate loans. Julian chose a local branch because he needed the cash cleared immediately. He needed the funds deposited before I could legally evict him from the townhouse. He was racing against a clock. I memorized the bank branch address and the name of the loan officer listed on the digital inquiry ticket. I formulated a plan to walk into that bank lobby the moment their doors opened. I would not bring tears. I would bring my government-issued identification, my property deed, and my auditing credentials. Before I could close the browser, my phone buzzed again. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another aunt offering weaponized sympathy. But the ringtone was different. It was a custom tone I had set for one specific contact. I looked at the caller identification. It was Harrison. My grandfather never called before dawn unless a foal was breaching or a storm had knocked out the pasture fences. I picked up the device and pressed the green accept icon. "Victoria," he said. His voice was crisp, carrying the gravelly texture of a man who had already been awake for hours. "Yes, Grandpa," I answered. "I read Diane's public announcement," he said. The disdain in his tone was palpable. She always did prefer cheap fiction over the truth. "Are you safe?" "I am at a hotel on the interstate," I replied. "I left the townhouse." "Good," he said. "Bricks can be replaced." Do not let them drag you into a public shouting match. That is what your mother wants. She wants you to look unstable so she can justify her own rot. "I am not shouting," I told him. "I am pulling my financial records. Julian is attempting to take out a credit line against my house." A heavy silence fell over the line. I could hear the faint sound of a coffee mug being set down on a wooden table. When Harrison spoke again, the cadence of his voice had shifted from protective grandfather to a seasoned tactician. "Your mother thinks she holds all the leverage because she controls the family narrative," Harrison said. "She thinks she can starve you out of your own life by turning the relatives against you. She is acting with the confidence of a woman who believes her future is fully funded." He paused, letting the crisp morning air hum through the receiver. "I need you to drive out to the farm right now, Victoria. Bring your laptop and your identification. Diane is borrowing against a future she does not own. I have a counter move ready, and it requires your signature." I closed my encrypted laptop and slid it back into my leather tote bag. The pale morning sun was just starting to burn off the interstate fog as I walked out of the hotel. The air carried a sharp chill biting through my thin silk dress. I had not changed clothes since the engagement party. I still wore the uniform of my own betrayal. But my posture had shifted. I was no longer a stunned bride. I was an auditor preparing for a hostile takeover. I drove east, away from the concrete sprawl of Lexington and out toward the rolling bluegrass hills. The highway narrowed into a two-lane county road, flanked by endless stretches of dark wooden fencing. This was horse country. It was quiet, deliberate, and unforgiving to anyone who did not respect the labor it demanded. As the tires of my sedan hummed against the asphalt, I thought about my mother's financial calculus. Diane operated her entire life on a foundation of anticipated wealth. 15 years ago, my grandmother passed away. In the aftermath of that grief, Harrison drafted a standard, simple will, leaving his entire estate to his only child. Diane had treated that piece of paper like a guaranteed winning lottery ticket ever since. She looked at my grandfather's 150 acres and saw only a future subdivision. She looked at his tractors, his barns, and his grazing thoroughbreds, and calculated their liquidation value to fund her country club dues and Harper's endless crises. Diane believed her future was an impenetrable fortress built on that 15-year-old document. I turned my steering wheel, guiding the car onto a long gravel driveway. The crunch of the stones under my tires announced my arrival. Harrison's farm spread out before me, a testament to a half-century of unbroken discipline. The morning dew coated the sprawling green pastures. A dozen horses grazed near the tree line, their coats slick and healthy. The main house was a sturdy brick structure wrapped by a wide wraparound porch. It lacked the ostentatious columns of Diane's suburban mansion, but it carried a quiet, undeniable authority. I parked near the front steps and grabbed my tote bag. Before I even reached the wooden door, it swung open. Harrison stood in the entryway holding a ceramic coffee mug. He wore worn denim jeans and a heavy flannel work shirt. He did not offer a pitying hug or a sorrowful look. He simply nodded toward the hallway, instructing me to follow him into the study. The study smelled of old paper lemon oil and pipe tobacco. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, holding decades of veterinary manuals and agricultural ledgers. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, offering a dry, steady heat that finally chased the hotel chill from my skin. Sitting in a leather wingback chair across from Harrison's heavy oak desk was a second man. He wore a crisp gray suit and held a silver fountain pen. I recognized him immediately. It was Harlan Pratt, the estate attorney who had managed the farm's legal affairs since I was a child. "Sit down," Victoria Harrison said, gesturing to the empty chair beside Harlan. I took my seat, placing my tote bag on the floor. I retrieved my government-issued identification, placing it on the edge of the polished wood. Harrison walked behind his desk and sat heavily in his chair. He set his coffee mug down and linked his rough fingers together. "Your mother called me at 5 this morning," Harrison began, his voice low and steady. "She woke me up to deliver her carefully rehearsed tragedy. She told me Julian left you because your career made you cold. She told me Harper is carrying a miracle and that the family must rally around her. She asked me for a $50,000 advance on her inheritance to help the new parents purchase a suitable home." I stared at him. The puzzle pieces snapped into place with a sharp, sickening clarity. Julian was at the downtown bank attempting to forge my signature for a $50,000 equity line, while Diane was simultaneously attempting to extract the exact same amount from Harrison. They were hedging their bets, attacking my property and Harrison's estate at the same time to guarantee their payout. "She is spending money she thinks she already owns." Harrison continued, "Diane views my death as her retirement plan. She is banking on a will I wrote 15 years ago. She assumes the day my heart stops beating, this land will automatically transfer into her hands through the probate courts. She plans to pave these pastures and sell the lots to developers so she can keep Harper wrapped in bubble wrap for the rest of her life." Harrison leaned forward, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "I will not allow my 50 years of labor to fund a generational rot," he said. "I will not let that woman hand this farm over to a coward who breaks my granddaughter's heart in public." Harlan, the attorney, cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He opened the leather folio resting on his lap. "If Diane relies on the old will, she expects a lengthy probate process," Harlan explained. "Probate is a public court procedure. It is messy, and it allows disgruntled family members to file injunctions, contest the documents, and drag the estate through years of costly litigation. Your mother believes she holds the high ground in any legal battle because she is the direct biological daughter. If we merely update the will to disinherit her, she will drag you into a courtroom claiming undue influence or mental decline on Harrison's part." Harlan extracted a thick stack of legal documents from the folio and placed them squarely on the center of the oak desk. "Therefore, we are not using a will," Harlan said. "We are bypassing the probate court entirely." Harrison reached out and tapped his index finger against the top page. "This is a living, irrevocable trust," Harrison said. "It is the legal equivalent of a titanium vault. As of this morning, I am removing the farm, the equipment, the water rights, and all my liquid capital from my personal estate. I am transferring ownership of every single asset I possess into this trust. Because it is irrevocable, it cannot be altered, undone, or challenged once the ink dries." I looked at the documents, then up at my grandfather. "Who controls the trust?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You do," Harrison replied without a second's hesitation. "You are named as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. You manage the assets while I am alive, and you inherit them instantly the second I am gone. No judges, no court dates, no public filings. The transition of power happens in a vacuum." I absorbed the magnitude of his countermove. This was not a simple inheritance. It was a preemptive strike. Harrison was stripping Diane of her primary weapon before she even realized she was in a war. She would spend the next several months parading around the country club, leveraging her status as the future heir to a massive Kentucky estate. She would take out loans, promise Julian a lavish lifestyle, and plan her development projects based on an asset pool that no longer existed. Harlan handed me the silver fountain pen. "We need your signature to accept the role of trustee," Harlan said quietly. "I am a licensed notary. Once I stamp these pages, the transfer is executed. The old will becomes a worthless piece of scrap paper. Diane is effectively disinherited as of 9 o'clock this morning." I picked up the pen. The metal barrel felt heavy and cold against my fingers. I thought about the charm bracelet on my mother's wrist. I thought about the designer maternity dress I had unknowingly purchased. I thought about the forged credit application waiting in a bank queue downtown. They had demanded I be the strong one. They expected me to step aside and fund their comfort. They wanted me to play my assigned role in their theater of exploitation. I pressed the nib of the pen against the thick parchment paper. I signed my full legal name in blue ink. I signed the second page, then the third. Each stroke of the pen felt like severing a chain that had bound me since childhood. Harlan collected the documents, pressing his heavy notary seal onto the signature lines. The sharp crunch of the metal stamp echoed in the quiet study, sealing the fate of the family. Harrison stood up, gathering the executed documents. He slipped them into a thick, pristine manila envelope. He fastened the string closure, wrapping it tightly in a figure eight. The fire in the hearth popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. Harrison walked around the desk and stood in front of me. He held out the heavy, county-stamped folder. I reached out and took it, feeling the undeniable weight of 150 acres resting in my hands. Diane thinks she is inheriting a kingdom, Harrison said, his voice carrying the finality of a closing door. She has no idea she is inheriting a ghost town. The weight of the manila envelope grounded me. It was a physical anchor in a morning defined by shifting realities. I placed the trust documents carefully into my tote bag, ensuring they rested flat against my encrypted laptop. I thanked Harrison and Harlan, leaving the warmth of the study for the crisp Kentucky air. The drive back into Lexington felt different. The panic that had chased me down the highway hours earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, methodical focus. I was no longer a victim fleeing a betrayal. I was the sole trustee of a multi-million-dollar estate, and I had a fraud investigation to complete. I parked my car 3 blocks from the regional bank branch listed on the credit monitoring alert. I needed the walk to clear my head and organize my talking points. The morning sun was fully up now, glaring off the glass facades of the downtown financial district. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the bank at exactly 9:15. The lobby smelled of polished granite and fresh coffee. I bypassed the teller line and walked directly to the reception desk. I presented my government identification, my corporate auditing credentials, and the property deed to my townhouse. I need to speak with the branch manager immediately, I told the receptionist. There is an unauthorized application for a $50,000 equity line pending against my primary residence. My tone left no room for customer service platitudes. Within 4 minutes, I was sitting in a glass-walled office across from a regional manager named Marcus. He wore a nervous expression, tapping a ballpoint pen against his desk blotter. Bank managers despise the word unauthorized, especially when it precedes a 5-figure loan application. Marcus pulled up the digital file on his monitor. He confirmed the details aligning perfectly with the alert I received at 1 a.m. An application had been submitted electronically requesting a maximum draw against the equity of my property. The primary applicant listed on the file is Julian Vance Marcus, stated, adjusting his monitor. You are listed as the cosigner and the primary collateral owner. Julian does not own the collateral, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. He is on the mortgage instrument, not the deed. He cannot leverage an asset he does not legally possess. Furthermore, I never authorized this application. I did not sign a single document. Marcus frowned, his fingers flying across the keyboard. We have a digital signature on file, Ms. Moore, he said, pulling up a PDF document on his screen. It was recorded via our secure electronic portal, and our underwriting department completed a standard phone verification yesterday afternoon. According to the log, a representative spoke with you directly to confirm your consent to the equity draw. I stared at the screen. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Yesterday afternoon, I was standing on a raised stage in a downtown Chicago hotel ballroom. I was delivering a 90-minute keynote speech on corporate compliance structures to an audience of 300 industry professionals. I had my phone turned off. I did not speak to a bank underwriter. I did not sign an electronic document. I need the exact timestamp of that digital signature, I said, pulling a notepad from my tote bag. And I need the exact time and duration of the verification phone call. Marcus hesitated, citing internal privacy protocols. I slid my auditing credentials across his desk. I reminded him that processing a fraudulent loan application constitutes federal wire fraud, and that his branch was currently serving as the conduit for a felony. The threat of an FBI inquiry dissolved his hesitation. The digital signature was recorded at 2:14 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, he read from the screen. The verification call was placed at 2:30 p.m., lasting exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds. I wrote the numbers down. The timing was flawless. Julian knew my itinerary. He knew I would be on a stage without access to my devices. He calculated the perfect window to execute the forgery. But Julian was arrogant, and arrogance always leaves a digital footprint. I pulled my encrypted laptop from my bag and connected to the bank's guest network. I logged into my mobile service provider portal. I navigated to the call forwarding settings and the raw usage logs. I turned my laptop screen around so Marcus could see the data. At 1:15 p.m. yesterday, an internal command was issued from my shared family plan dashboard, I explained, pointing to the log. Someone logged into the account and initiated a call forwarding protocol. Every incoming call to my primary cell phone was automatically diverted to a secondary prepaid line. That prepaid line was purchased 3 days ago at a big box retailer 2 miles from my townhouse. I scrolled down to the call log, highlighting a specific entry. At 2:30 p.m., an incoming call from your underwriting department was successfully routed to that burner phone, I said. The call lasted 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Whoever answered that phone impersonated me and authorized a $50,000 loan against my home. Marcus stopped tapping his pen. His face lost its remaining color. He was no longer dealing with a domestic dispute over a shared bank account. He was staring at a textbook case of identity theft, executed across state lines. I need the IP address attached to that digital signature, I demanded. Marcus typed rapidly, retrieving the requested data string. He wrote it on a Post-it note and slid it across the desk. I ran the IP address through a standard geolocation tracker. The results pinned the location to a residential broadband router in Lexington, Kentucky. Specifically, it matched the router sitting in the living room of my townhouse. The townhouse where Julian had spent the entire afternoon, supposedly working from home. The evidence was airtight. Julian had forwarded my calls, forged my digital signature, intercepted the bank's verification procedure, and attempted to extract $500,000 from my property. He committed multiple federal offenses to secure a cash payout before executing his public exit strategy at the engagement party. He needed the liquid cash because he knew Diane's inheritance was not accessible yet. He needed a bridge fund to support Harper until the grandfather passed away. Julian was treating my credit profile like a short-term ATM. Cancel the application, I instructed Marcus. Place a hard fraud freeze on my entire profile with your institution. If Julian Vance attempts to access this building or initiate any further transactions, you are to contact the authorities immediately. Marcus nodded vigorously, typing the fraud codes into his terminal. The $50,000 threat was neutralized. I walked out of the bank with a printed copy of the forged application, the IP logs, and the internal banknotes confirming the intercepted phone call. I stopped at an office supply store 3 blocks down the street. The bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I browsed the aisles. I did not need colorful binders or decorative folders. I needed something sturdy and clinical. I purchased a pack of heavy, pristine manila envelopes. The thick paper felt substantial in my hands. I returned to my hotel room and sat at the laminate desk. I opened one of the new envelopes. I slid the county-stamped irrevocable trust documents to the back, forming the foundation. On top of the trust, I placed the printed IP logs, proving the location of the forgery. Next went the mobile provider records, detailing the call forwarding intercept. Finally, I placed the forged HELOC application on the very top, the fraudulent digital signature glaring in black ink. I wrapped the string closure tightly around the double brad fastening the trap. This was no longer a messy breakup involving a pregnant sister and a cheating fiancé. It was a documented federal crime. The narrative of the delicate sister and the cold career woman meant absolutely nothing in the face of wire fraud. Diane could spin her country club tales until she lost her voice. Julian could practice his breathy apologies in the mirror. None of it mattered now. I had the facts securely bound in heavy paper. The trap was now physical. It was sitting on my desk, waiting to be deployed. Before I could lock the envelope inside my safe, my cell phone buzzed. An incoming email notification flashed across the screen. I opened the application expecting a work-related memo. Instead, I found a message from my mother. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained a single PDF attachment. I opened the document. It was a formal invoice generated through a professional event planning software. The total amount due was $5,000. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the sheer audacity of the demand. Diane and Harper were operating in a completely different reality. While I was building a federal fraud case against Julian, they were busy calculating the aesthetic damages of my departure. I stared at the digital document displayed on my phone screen. $5,000. The line items were categorized with professional precision. Floral arrangements, gourmet catering, a non-refundable deposit for a private venue rental. Diane had typed a brief message in the body of the email. Since you abandoned the family last night and caused such an unpleasant scene, we feel it is only right that you cover the deposit for Harper's shower. We need to restore the joy you disrupted. Attached to the invoice was a digital proof of the shower invitation. It featured pastel greenery and delicate gold cursive lettering. I scrolled to the bottom of the elegant graphic, expecting to see registry details or a heartfelt quote. Instead, there was a dedicated section titled Event Sponsors. My name sat right below a local high-end maternity boutique and a pediatric chiropractor. They were not inviting an aunt to celebrate a new life. They were billing a corporate entity to fund their aesthetic performance. My mother always treated family milestones like ticketed galas. When I graduated from college with honors, she threw a lavish party and charged my father for the catering costs out of his alimony payments. She viewed relationships as ledgers, where everyone owed her a baseline level of visual perfection. Because I walked out of the country club without giving her a screaming match, I had denied her the dramatic victim narrative she craved. This invoice was her penalty fee. She wanted to extract cash to soothe her bruised ego and maintain her country club facade. Blissfully unaware of the federal fraud trail I had just uncovered at the bank, Diane and Harper were operating in a fabricated reality. They assumed my swift departure from the townhouse was a retreat born of fragile heartbreak. They believed I was sitting in a hotel room, weeping over a ruined wedding dress, ready to purchase their forgiveness. I did not draft a reply to the email. Engaging with delusions only grants them validity. I forwarded the message to a secure, encrypted folder and closed the application. I picked up the heavy manila envelope from the laminate desk. The string closure felt secure under my thumb. I drove into downtown Lexington, navigating the narrow one-way streets until I reached the Central Police Precinct. The building provided a stark contrast to the plush, velvet interiors of the country club and the polished granite of the bank. It smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and tired ozone. Fluorescent tubes hummed a sterile white light over the scuffed linoleum tiles. I walked up to the intake desk. The officer on duty looked up from a clipboard, his expression weary. "I need to file a formal report for identity theft and wire fraud," I said. My voice was crisp and leveled, carrying the exact tone I used during quarterly board meetings. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in an interview room with an economic crimes detective named Miller. He had dark circles under his eyes and a half-empty foam cup sitting on his scratched metal desk. People bring domestic disputes into police precincts every single day, hoping the badge will scare a cheating spouse or settle a petty grievance. Detective Miller looked prepared to dismiss me as a scorned bride seeking a cheap form of revenge. Then I opened the manila envelope. I did not mention the baby shower. I did not mention the pregnancy or the diamond ring sitting in a glass of champagne. I kept the narrative strictly confined to the financial data. I handed him the printed IP logs. I handed him the mobile provider call routing data. I slid the forged bank application across the metal table. Julian Vance intercepted a bank verification call and forged a digital signature to draw $50,000 against my property, I explained, pointing to the timestamps. Here is the routing protocol showing the call forwarded to a burner phone. Here is the origin IP address matching his current physical location. Detective Miller's posture shifted. He sat up straighter, picking up the call logs and tracing the timestamps with a blue pen. He recognized the clean, unassailable structure of the evidence. I had done the investigative auditing work for him. He did not have to hunt for a motive or draft a subpoena for the telecom records. The paper trail was flawless, leaving no room for subjective interpretation. He looked from the papers to my face. The skepticism in his eyes vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a law enforcement officer looking at a sealed case. "You documented this very well, Ms. Moore," he said. "I am a corporate compliance auditor," I replied. "Documentation is my currency." He typed the information into the precinct database. The rhythmic clack of his keyboard filled the small room, anchoring the reality of the situation. Julian was no longer just a deceptive partner. His name was now entered into a criminal registry. Detective Miller printed a single sheet of paper and slid it toward me. It was an official police report, bearing a distinct 9-digit case number. "Keep this secure," Miller instructed. "We will initiate the formal inquiry and process the warrants. Do not confront him about this investigation. Let him think he got away with the initial application until we have our ducks in a row." I folded the police report and slid it into the manila envelope right next to the irrevocable trust documents. The trap was growing denser, carrying the weight of both civil and criminal law. I thanked the detective and walked out of the precinct. The midday sun was high, casting harsh shadows across the concrete steps of the police station. My cell phone vibrated in my pocket just as I reached the door handle of my sedan. A text message illuminated the lock screen. It was Julian. I slid into the driver's seat and read the message. "Your mother sent you the invoice for the shower. Pay it by noon tomorrow, Victoria. If you want to play games and freeze the joint checking account, two can play. Pay the $5,000 or I am calling a locksmith to change the deadbolts on the townhouse. Try getting your furniture back then." I stared at the glowing text. Julian was attempting to use my own physical property to extort me from my mother's party planning fund. He felt untouchable. He believed he held the high ground because he physically occupied the bricks and mortar of my home. He thought freezing the checking account was the extent of my retaliatory capacity. He had no idea a detective was currently reviewing his felony wire fraud 2 miles away. I read the thread again. Change the deadbolts. I realized that breaking their toxic alliance required a tactical retreat. If I fought him over the townhouse locks today, he might panic. He might look closer at his own digital footprint or contact a defense attorney. I needed him comfortable. I needed him arrogant. I needed Diane and Harper feeling invincible so they would lower their guard and walk blindly into the snare. To win a war against manipulators, you must give them exactly what they want until they choke on it. I needed to feed their delusion. I needed to craft a surrender so convincing they would assemble in one room to claim their prize. I stared at the illuminated screen of my cell phone reading Julian's threat for a third time. He was offering a crude ultimatum. Pay the $5,000 invoice for a baby shower I would never attend, or lose access to the physical structure of my own home. He wanted to push me into a corner, forcing a frantic reaction. He expected me to hire a lawyer to fight for the deadbolts, or to show up at the townhouse screaming on the front lawn. In corporate auditing, we utilize a specific tactic when dealing with hostile entities attempting to hide discrepancies. We hand them a decoy ledger. We give them a minor, easily solvable problem to focus on, so they feel a false sense of security while we dismantle their entire financial architecture from the ground up. I needed to hand my family a decoy. I needed to deploy a red herring so potent it would blind them to the federal snare closing around their ankles. I leaned back against the leather seat of my sedan. I opened a new text message thread and added Diane, Julian, and Harper as the recipients. I spent 4 minutes crafting the exact phrasing of my surrender. I chose my vocabulary with surgical precision, using the exact words they needed to hear to validate their twisted narrative. "I am exhausted," I typed. "I do not have the energy to fight this war anymore. Keep the $5,000. I will not freeze any more shared assets. If you agree to leave me alone and stop the public posts, I will bring a signed quitclaim deed to formally hand the townhouse over to Julian. You win. Let me fade out in peace." I pressed send. The digital bubble transitioned from green to delivered. I placed the phone in my cup holder and started the engine. The response time was a testament to their greed. I had not even reached the interstate on-ramp before the device vibrated. The first reply came from Diane. It was brief, carrying the polished magnanimity of a victor addressing a defeated rival. "We appreciate your maturity, Victoria. This is the right choice for the baby. We will see you on Friday to collect the paperwork." Julian's text arrived a minute later. It lacked any grace. It was just a single word. Agreed. They did not question the sudden capitulation. They did not wonder why a compliance auditor would voluntarily sign away a property she funded entirely on her own. Their arrogance functioned as a blinder. They believed my spirit had simply buckled under the weight of their combined rejection. They thought the strong one had finally learned her place. Over the next 7 days, I operated from the sterile quiet of my hotel room. The silence became my greatest asset. I did not log on to social media, but I maintained a ghost account to monitor their public activities. The dramatic irony of the week was a physical sensation, like watching someone strike a match inside a room filled with invisible gas. By Tuesday, Harper was posting photographs from the aisles of a high-end hardware store. She stood next to Julian, holding up a series of pastel paint swatches. The caption read, "Picking out the perfect shade of Swiss coffee for our new nursery. New beginnings in our forever home." They were standing in an aisle debating eggshell versus matte finishes for a bedroom located inside a frozen crime scene. While they debated paint colors, I finalized the perimeter. On Wednesday, I drove back to the regional bank branch in downtown Lexington. I sat with Marcus, the branch manager, and signed the final hard fraud freeze documents. The $50,000 equity line was officially locked and flagged in the Federal Registry. The townhouse was now a toxic asset for anyone attempting to leverage it. Julian could paint the walls any shade he desired, but he could not extract a single dime from the brick and mortar. On Thursday, I met with Detective Miller at the precinct. He confirmed the telecom warrants were processed. The local district attorney was reviewing the digital signature logs. The wheels of the justice system turn at a slow, deliberate pace, but they grind forward with inevitable force. Miller assured me the indictment was pending. I just needed to keep Julian comfortable and anchored in Lexington until the officers arrived with the paperwork. On Friday morning, I visited a local print shop. I paid 30 cents to print a standard Kentucky quitclaim deed. It was a single page of legal boilerplate requiring the grantor to relinquish all claims to a specified parcel of real estate. I left the signature line blank. I slid the crisp white paper into a separate, slim folder. This was my prop. It was a worthless piece of paper holding zero legal weight without a notary seal, but it was the bait required to gather them into one room. I spent the weekend resting. I ordered plain meals to my room. I reviewed the irrevocable trust documents, ensuring every clause drafted by Harlan was committed to my memory. I had the deed to the farm. I had the police report. I had the bank logs. The manila envelope sat on the laminate desk, growing heavier with every passing day. By the following Wednesday, the trap was fully set. I had constructed an airtight vault around my future and a concrete cell around theirs. I felt a profound sense of control. The erratic emotional spikes that defined my engagement and my family dynamics were gone, replaced by the steady hum of calculated justice. I lay in the stiff hotel bed listening to the steady drum of evening rain against the window pane. The digital clock read 11:40 p.m. I closed my eyes, preparing for a full night of sleep before the final confrontation. Then the silence shattered. My cell phone rang on the nightstand. It was not a text message chime or an email alert. It was a persistent, jarring ringtone. I sat up, pulling the device from the charger. The screen glared in the dark room. The caller identification did not list a family member. It displayed the name of the working foreman at Harrison's horse farm. a man named Elias who had tended the pastures for 2 decades. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Elias would never call a personal cell phone at midnight unless a catastrophic failure had occurred on the property. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Elias," I said, keeping my voice steady, "what is happening?" The line was quiet for a long second. I could hear the heavy sound of the Kentucky rain falling on a tin roof in the background. When Elias spoke, his voice carried a raw, hollow texture that stripped the air from my lungs. "Ms. Moore," Elias said, "I am sorry to call you so late. The paramedics just left the main house." I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My bare feet hit the cold carpet. "Tell me, Elias." "It is your grandfather," Elias said, his breath hitching slightly. "His heart gave out in his sleep about an hour ago. He passed away, Victoria. He is gone." The phone felt heavy in my hand. The steady hum of the hotel air conditioner seemed to amplify, filling the void left by his words. Harrison, the man who had stood up at my engagement party and severed the toxic ties, the man who had signed away his entire life to protect mine, was gone. The only buffer between me and the unhinged greed of my mother had just been removed from the board. I thanked Elias. I hung up the phone. I sat in the dark hotel room, staring at the heavy manila envelope resting on the desk. The landscape of the war had just shifted violently. Diane would receive the phone call from the county coroner by morning. She would wake up believing the 15-year-old will had just been activated. She would believe she was waking up as a multi-million-dollar landowner. The red herring had served its purpose, keeping them distracted. Now the game was over. The true collision was imminent. The psychological buffer was gone. Harrison had been the only member of the Moore lineage who understood that loyalty was an action, not an entitlement. His sudden absence ripped a hole in the fabric of my life, leaving me entirely exposed to the raw, unfiltered greed of my mother. Diane did not view grief as a process of mourning. She viewed it as a transition of capital. I knew before the sun rose over the interstate that she would waste 0 time securing her perceived inheritance. The viewing was scheduled 3 days later at a high-end funeral parlor on the affluent side of Lexington. It was a sprawling facility with thick burgundy carpets, muted lighting, and an aesthetic designed to mask the reality of death under a layer of expensive mahogany. I arrived an hour before the public visitation. I did not wear the tailored black silk shift dress I usually reserved for corporate galas. I wore black slacks, a plain blouse, and draped over my shoulders was Harrison's old canvas work jacket. The faded olive fabric smelled faintly of hay and pipe tobacco. It felt like armor. I stepped into the main viewing parlor. The heavy double doors closed behind me, muffling the sound of the street traffic outside. The room was already vibrating with a frantic, manic energy. Diane was not weeping quietly in the front row. She was pacing the center aisle, issuing directives with the sharp, clipping tone of a CEO conducting a hostile acquisition. She wore a custom-tailored black morning suit accessorized with a thick strand of pearls. Harper sat in the front pew, dabbing her dry eyes with the monogrammed tissue. Julian hovered near the floral arrangements, holding a clipboard, looking like an over-eager intern assisting an executive. "I want these lilies moved further back," Diane snapped, pointing a manicured finger at a massive white arrangement. "They are obstructing the sightline from the foyer. The country club board members will be arriving at 2 o'clock. I want the presentation to be flawless." I stood in the shadowed corner near the heavy velvet drapes, watching the performance. The dynamic of the room had shifted violently since the engagement party. 2 weeks ago, Diane had orchestrated a public betrayal to secure Julian a stable household. Today, she was operating on a completely different tier of entitlement. She believed she had just crossed the threshold into the elite landowner class. The 15-year-old will was the engine driving her euphoria. She believed the document granted her immediate, absolute control over the 150-acre horse farm, the equipment, the liquid capital, and the entire Moore legacy. She walked across the burgundy carpet with the aggressive swagger of a woman who felt she had finally won a lifelong lottery. A man in a sharp charcoal suit approached Diane. He wore a subdued, sympathetic expression, holding a thick leather folio. He was the funeral director, a man tasked with translating grief into high-margin sales. "Mrs. Moore," he said softly, lowering his voice to a practiced, reverent whisper, "we need to finalize the payment authorization for the upgraded bronze casket and the extended catering services for the reception room." Diane turned to him, her pearls clicking softly against her collarbone. She waved her hand in a dismissive, airy gesture, as if discussing a petty cash expense. "Just forward the entire invoice to my father's estate account," she instructed, her voice carrying a bright, brittle cheerfulness. "The total is around $15,000, correct?" "That will be fine. Send it to Harlan Pratt at the law firm. He manages the ledger. I will sign the authorization papers on Monday when I officially assume the executorship." The funeral director nodded smoothly, making a quick note on his ledger. "Excellent, Mrs. Moore. We will ensure everything meets your standards." I tightened my grip on the frayed lapels of Harrison's jacket. The dramatic irony of the exchange hit me with a physical force. It was a suffocating pressure, knowing a secret so immense it rendered the entire room a farce. Diane was standing over her father's open casket, casually authorizing a $15,000 expense against an account she did not own. She believed she was dictating terms from a position of absolute financial superiority. She had no idea she was legally a ghost. The estate account she was attempting to bill had been drained to zero the moment Harrison signed the irrevocable trust. The liquid capital, the land, the equipment, it all belonged exclusively to the trust, and I was the sole trustee. She did not have the authority to authorize a $15 floral arrangement, let alone a premium bronze casket. The invoice she just redirected to Harlan Pratt would bounce back immediately, labeled unauthorized. She was spending phantom money, writing checks on an empty account. I watched Harper stand up from the pew, smoothing the front of her black maternity dress. She walked over to Julian, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Did Mom talk to the realtor yet?" Harper asked, her voice carrying across the quiet parlor. "We need to know when the farm is listing. If we are going to close on the new house in the suburbs, we need the cash advance from the land sale before the baby comes." Julian stroked Harper's hair, nodding reassuringly. "Diane said she is meeting with an agricultural broker next week," he replied. "The land valuation is huge, Harper. We are covered. You do not need to stress about the budget anymore." They were already carving up the acreage. They were looking at my grandfather's 50 years of labor and seeing only a down payment for a sprawling suburban mansion. They viewed the bluegrass pastures as a liquidated asset designed to fund their comfort. They had ruined my engagement. They had stolen my wedding funds. They had attempted to forge a $50,000 equity line against my primary residence. Now they were attempting to strip the last remaining piece of my family legacy to finance their theft. I felt a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline overriding the cold forensic calm I had cultivated over the past 2 weeks. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect of their conversation demanded an immediate response. I wanted to step out of the shadows, walk down the center aisle, and drop the trust documents right onto the lid of the bronze casket. I wanted to watch Diane's manicured facade crumble. I wanted to watch Julian realize the bank vault he thought he had unlocked was actually an empty room. I took a half step forward, my boots sinking into the thick carpet. But I stopped. I remembered the heavy manila envelope sitting in the safe back at the hotel room. I remembered Detective Miller's instructions. I remembered the trap. If I confronted them now in the middle of a funeral home, I would hand Diane the chaotic scene she desperately desired. She would spin my revelation as the hysterical ranting of a grieving, discarded granddaughter. She would claim I was fabricating documents out of spite. She would use the audience of country club mourners to paint me as the villain, disrupting a solemn occasion. The execution of justice requires patience. It requires allowing the target to step fully into the snare before pulling the rope tight. I stepped back into the shadows, pulling the canvas jacket tighter around my shoulders. I let them continue their performance. I let Diane greet the arriving guests with the gracious smile of an affluent heir. I let Harper accept condolences while casually mentioning her new house hunting plans. I let Julian strut around the parlor acting like the newly minted patriarch of a rising dynasty. I stood in the corner for 3 hours, observing the anatomy of their delusion. I recorded every arrogant comment, every whispered plan, every assumed victory. I cataloged it all, adding it to the mental ledger I would balance when the time was right. The visitation concluded, and the guests slowly filtered out into the gray afternoon. The funeral director ushered the immediate family toward the side exit, leading to the private reception hall for coffee and catered sandwiches. I waited until the main parlor was mostly empty before walking toward the side door. The air in the narrow hallway smelled strongly of roasted coffee beans and stale pastries. As I reached for the brass handle of the reception room door, a figure stepped out from an adjacent alcove blocking my path. It was Julian. He wore the dark, custom suit I had paid for 14 months ago. His posture was rigid, carrying a false confidence generated by his proximity to Diane's imagined wealth. He did not look at me with the nervous hesitation of a man who had committed federal wire fraud. He looked at me with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully completed a hostile takeover. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of crisp white paper and a sleek silver ballpoint pen. He unfolded the document and held it out toward me. I recognized the formatting instantly. It was a standard Kentucky quitclaim deed, identical to the decoy I had printed at the copy shop. "You said you were done fighting, Victoria," Julian said, his voice low and hard. "You promised in the text message. Your mother has enough on her plate managing the estate transition today. I want this handled now. Sign the deed. Hand over the townhouse." The narrow hallway outside the reception room was quiet, save for the low hum of the vending machine in the corner. The scent of roasted coffee beans mingled heavily with the cloying odor of funeral lilies. I stood, facing the man who had slept in my bed, spent my savings, and forged my name, holding a blank piece of legal paper that represented the culmination of his theft. Julian extended the silver ballpoint pen toward me. The metallic casing caught the dim overhead light. He did not look apologetic. He did not look ashamed. He looked impatient, like a mid-level manager waiting for an intern to sign a routine time card. "We agreed on this," Victoria Julian said, his tone shifting from demand to a patronizing coax. "You sent the text message. You said you were exhausted and wanted to fade out in peace. This is your exit ticket. Just sign the document and we can all move forward." I looked at the document. The header clearly read, "Quitclaim deed," in bold black letters. Below the header were the blank fields requiring my signature and a notary seal. He was asking me to legally abandon a brick-and-mortar property I had purchased with a decade of investment yields, while standing 20 feet away from my grandfather's casket. The sheer magnitude of the disrespect was almost architectural in its structure. It was built on a foundation of absolute entitlement, reinforced by years of Diane conditioning them to view me as a limitless resource. Before I could respond, the reception room door swung open. Harper stepped into the hallway, holding a small china plate loaded with finger sandwiches. She wore a black silk maternity dress that hugged the distinct curve of her stomach. Diane trailed closely behind her, holding a cup of black coffee, her pearl necklace gleaming against her dark suit. They saw Julian holding the deed and the pen. Instead of retreating, giving us a moment of privacy, they immediately formed a unified front, flanking Julianne on either side. They moved with the synchronized precision of a pack sensing a wounded animal. "Is there a problem here?" Diane asked, taking a slow sip of her coffee. Her eyes darted from the paper in Julianne's hand to my face. "We are trying to conduct a respectful memorial reception, Victoria. Do not create unnecessary drama today." "I am not creating anything," I replied, my voice low and steady. "Julian is attempting to execute a real estate transfer in a hallway during a funeral." Harper sighed loudly, balancing her china plate on her hip. She rubbed her stomach with her free hand, adopting the practiced expression of a weary martyr. "It is just a piece of paper," Victoria Harper said, her voice dripping with weaponized empathy. "You promised you would sign it. You have to understand, this is part of my healing journey. We cannot build a stable environment for the baby while ownership of the townhouse is in limbo. You are making this transition incredibly stressful for me. Julian nodded in agreement, adjusting his posture. He reached up and tugged at the collar of his suit jacket, grimacing slightly. "The tailor cut this collar way too tight," Julian complained, addressing no one in particular. "I have a tension headache from the fabric pulling at my neck." I stared at the collar he was complaining about. I recognized the distinct cross-stitch pattern on the lapel. It was a custom Italian wool suit. I had paid $2,000 for that exact suit, putting the charge on my rewards credit card 14 months ago, so he would look presentable for our engagement photos. He was standing in front of me, demanding I hand over my house while actively complaining about the fit of the clothing I had purchased for him. The absurdity of the situation stripped away any lingering traces of familial obligation. I did not feel a spike of rage. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection. I felt a profound, icy calm. The forensic detachment I cultivated in the hotel room solidified into an impenetrable shield. I was no longer looking at my sister, my mother, or my former fiancé. I was looking at 3 hostile entities executing a coordinated asset grab. "You are being entirely unreasonable," Diane interjected, setting her coffee cup on a nearby side table. "You have a lucrative corporate career, Victoria. You can easily afford to rent a luxury apartment downtown. Harper and Julian need the square footage of the townhouse. Furthermore, you are about to receive a little piece of my new inheritance." She paused, adjusting her pearl necklace, ensuring the statement carried the appropriate weight. When I finalized the sale of the farm to the commercial developers, Diane continued, her tone dripping with magnanimous charity. "I intend to set aside a small trust fund for you. It will be more than enough to cover a down payment on a new condo. So signing this deed today is really the least you could do to show good faith. Consider it a down payment on your future inheritance." I looked at Diane. She was negotiating with phantom capital. She was offering me a small allowance funded by the liquidation of a farm she did not legally own to bribe me into surrendering a house Julian was actively attempting to defraud. It was a recursive loop of theft built entirely on delusions and forged documents. They were expecting the old Victoria to surface. They were waiting for the strong one, the reliable wallet, the compliant daughter who always absorbed the cost to keep the peace. They expected me to take the silver pen, sign the deed, and walk away, to protect the aesthetic of the funeral reception. I did not reach for the pen. I kept my hands resting inside the deep pockets of Harrison's canvas work jacket. I smiled. It was a tight, constrained expression, devoid of any warmth. "I will not sign a binding real estate document in a public hallway next to a vending machine," I said. The acoustics of the narrow corridor amplified the hard edge of my voice. "I am an auditor. I do not execute unnotarized contracts on a whim." Julian's jaw tightened. The false confidence flickered, revealing a flash of genuine panic. He needed the physical deed signed to legitimize the $50,000 equity line he had already submitted to the downtown bank. He knew the fraud freeze was likely looming, and he needed the property title transferred into his name before the federal investigators connected the IP addresses. "You promised," Victoria Julian snapped, taking a step closer. The silver pen hovered inches from my chest. "You sent the text. You said you were done fighting." "I am done fighting," I agreed, maintaining the tight smile. "But I prefer to conduct my business in a proper setting." I looked past Julian, making direct eye contact with Diane. She was the architect of this entitlement. She needed to be the one to host the final collapse. "We will settle everything on Friday," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "We will settle the deed to the townhouse. We will settle the estate accounts. We will settle the sale of the farm and the distribution of the money." Diane raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting from irritation to sudden, intense curiosity. "Where?" "At the farm," I replied. "In Harrison's dining room. We will meet at noon. Bring Julian. Bring Harper." I paused, letting the silence stretch for a full 3 seconds, ensuring the next sentence landed with maximum impact. "And bring your real estate lawyer." Diane's eyes widened. A slow, triumphant grin spread across her face. She misinterpreted my demand entirely. She assumed I was calling a formal meeting to surrender. She believed asking for her lawyer meant I was ready to draft the final concession paperwork, handing over the townhouse, and accepting the meager allowance she promised from the farm sale. She thought the strong one had finally broken completely. "Excellent," Diane said, her voice bright with victory. "I will have my attorney draft the transfer agreements for the townhouse and the preliminary disclosures for the farm liquidation. We will finalize everything over lunch." Julian let out a long breath, lowering the silver pen. He slid the blank quitclaim deed back into his suit pocket. He looked relieved, assuming the delay was merely a bureaucratic hurdle before his payday. Harper smiled brightly, rubbing her stomach and whispering something about nursery furniture. I turned away from them. I did not say goodbye. I walked down the narrow hallway, pushed open the heavy glass exit door, and stepped out into the gray afternoon. The air felt clean. The trap was set. The bait was taken. They were marching willingly toward the snare, entirely convinced they were walking into a coronation. They had no idea Friday would not be a settlement. It would be a slaughter. Friday morning broke over Kentucky with a sharp, brilliant clarity. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, offering no shelter from the sun. I drove the familiar route out to the farm, the tires of my sedan humming a steady rhythm against the asphalt. The drive usually served as a decompression chamber, a space where I mentally transitioned from the clinical demands of corporate auditing to the quiet labor of my grandfather's acreage. Today, the drive was a countdown. I arrived at the property at 11:30, giving myself exactly 30 minutes to secure the perimeter before the invasion force arrived. The farm was silent. The horses were grazing in the far south pasture, mere dark shapes against the distant tree line. Elias, the working foreman, had taken the ranch hands to town to pick up feed supplies at my request. I wanted the main house completely isolated. I wanted zero interruptions when the structural collapse occurred. I parked near the heavy wooden porch steps. I carried my leather tote bag inside, navigating the familiar hallway, until I reached the formal dining room. The space was dominated by a massive antique mahogany table, a piece of furniture Harrison had purchased at an estate auction 40 years ago. It bore the scuffs and scratches of decades of family dinners and quiet business deals. I took the chair at the absolute head of the table. I placed my tote bag on the floor next to my boots. I did not arrange any files. I did not set out a notepad or a pen. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, adopting a posture of total stillness. At precisely 11:55, the crunch of gravel echoed through the open windows. I listened to the car doors slamming. I heard the sharp staccato click of Diane's heels striking the wooden planks of the front porch. The front door swung open without a knock. Diane believed she owned the hinges, the door frame, and the land beneath it. She entered the house with the aggressive swagger of a conquering general surveying a captured territory. Harper and Julian trailed close behind her. Following them was a fourth individual, a man I had never seen before. He wore a shiny shark-skin suit that looked slightly too tight across the shoulders. He carried a battered leather briefcase and sported a thin layer of perspiration on his forehead, despite the cool weather. This was the sleazy real estate attorney Diane had hired to expedite the liquidation of the farm. Diane walked directly into the dining room, stopping abruptly when she saw me sitting at the head of the mahogany table. For a fraction of a second, her confidence wavered. The head of the table was traditionally Harrison's seat. It was a position of authority. Diane quickly recovered, brushing past the implication and taking a seat halfway down the right side. Julian pulled out a chair for Harper, ensuring she was comfortably seated before sitting down himself. The sleazy attorney took a spot next to Diane, opening his briefcase with a loud metallic snap. Diane did not begin the meeting immediately. She engaged in a blatant display of territorial dominance. She stood up and walked over to the antique crystal decanter resting on a side table. It was filled with Harrison's top-shelf Kentucky bourbon, a reserve he only poured for significant milestones. Diane unstopped the decanter and poured a generous measure into a heavy glass tumbler. The amber liquid splashed against the crystal, echoing loudly in the quiet room. She walked back to her chair, holding the glass aloft. "To new beginnings," Diane announced, her voice bright and brittle. She took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the performance more than the alcohol. "And to family, moving forward in unity." Harper offered a soft, breathy agreement, rubbing her stomach with a manicured hand. Julian nodded firmly, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. The sleazy attorney simply shuffled a stack of papers, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Diane set her glass down and steepled her fingers, resting her elbows on the mahogany surface. "Let us be efficient," Diane commanded, adopting a tone usually reserved for instructing hired help. "We have a dense agenda today, Victoria. First, we need to execute the property transfer for the townhouse. Julian brought the quitclaim deed. Once you sign it and my attorney notarizes the document, Harper and Julian can finally begin setting up the nursery without any lingering stress." She paused, taking another sip of the bourbon, letting the alcohol fuel her arrogance. Secondly, Diane continued her gaze sweeping around the dining room, taking in the crown molding and the antique furniture. "I have officially retained Mr. Vance here as my commercial broker. He has already compiled a preliminary valuation for the acreage. We are going to fast-track the sale of this farm to a commercial developer. They want to break ground on a luxury subdivision by next spring." She looked back at me, her expression shifting into a mask of aggressive pity. "As I promised at the funeral reception," Diane said, "I am setting aside a modest trust fund for you from the sale proceeds. It is a gesture of goodwill, Victoria. It is an acknowledgement of your willingness to cooperate today. You sign over the townhouse and you accept the severance package. Everyone walks away whole." I sat perfectly still. The silence stretched tight, pulling the tension in the room to a maximum frequency. I looked at Julian. He was leaning forward, his eyes fixed on my empty hands, waiting for me to reach for a pen. I looked at Harper. She was staring out the window, likely imagining the paint colors for a nursery inside a house she was actively attempting to steal. I looked at the sleazy attorney who was busy organizing a stack of unfiled court documents, entirely unaware he was sitting in the middle of a federal snare. Finally, I looked at my mother. Diane was glowing. She believed she had executed a flawless psychological siege. She believed she had starved the strong one out of her own life, forcing a total, unconditional surrender. She looked at me like a defeated animal waiting to be tagged and released. I did not yell. I did not accuse her of greed. I did not mention the engagement party or the shattered wedding plans. I maintained the cold, forensic calm that had guided me through the past 2 weeks. I leaned forward slightly, breaking the rigid posture I had held since they arrived. I reached down toward the floor, sliding my hand into the open top of my leather tote bag. My fingers bypassed the encrypted laptop and the hard copy financial ledgers. I felt the thick, heavy paper of the manila envelope. I grasped the edges and pulled it out. I lifted the envelope, bringing it into the sunlight streaming through the dining room windows. I placed it deliberately onto the antique mahogany table. I pushed it forward a few inches. The sound of the crisp paper sliding across the polished wood was incredibly loud, silencing the room instantly. The sliding sound cut through Diane's arrogance, halting her mid-sip. Julian stared at the envelope, a sudden frown creasing his forehead. He recognized the shape. It was not a single-page quitclaim deed. It was a dense packet of documents. "What is that?" Diane asked, her voice losing a fraction of its bright polish. "We do not need additional paperwork, Victoria. My attorney brought the necessary transfer forms." I kept my hand resting on top of the envelope, feeling the string closure under my palm. "I told you we would settle everything today," I said, my voice carrying a flat, unyielding authority. The townhouse, the estate, the sale of the farm. I unwound the string closure, wrapping the thread around the double brad in slow, deliberate circles. I flipped the flap open, exposing the stack of county-stamped documents and police records. Let us begin the settlement. The open flap of the manila envelope exposed a stack of documents thick enough to change the trajectory of 4 lives. I did not immediately pull the papers out. I let the visual weight of the packet sit in the center of the table, forcing them to confront the physical evidence of their impending collapse. Diane stared at the envelope, her jaw tightening. She took another quick sip of the bourbon, trying to wash the sudden dry taste of apprehension from her mouth. "I do not know what kind of delay tactic this is," Victoria Diane snapped, setting her glass down harder than necessary. "But my attorney is charging by the hour. We are not entertaining a counteroffer." I withdrew my hand from the envelope. I did not look at Diane. I looked toward the heavy wooden door leading into the adjacent hallway. "You can come in now, Harlan," I called out, keeping my voice at a conversational volume. The door swung open silently. Harlan Pratt stepped into the dining room. He wore the same crisp gray suit he had worn on the day I signed the trust documents. He carried his own leather folio tucked neatly under his arm. He walked into the room with the quiet, unassuming authority of a man who had navigated 1,000 high-stakes negotiations. Diane's eyes widened. She recognized Harlan instantly. He had managed Harrison's legal affairs for decades. She assumed he was still operating as a neutral arbiter, waiting to process the transfer of the estate into her name. "Harlan, what are you doing here?" Diane asked, her tone softening into a confused, demanding cadence. "I told your receptionist I would schedule a formal intake meeting next week. I have already retained Mr. Vance for the immediate commercial real estate matters." Harlan did not sit down. He stood behind my chair, resting a hand lightly on the back of the mahogany frame. "I am here serving as the legal representative for the sole trustee of this estate," Harlan replied smoothly. His voice carried zero inflection. He offered no professional courtesy to Diane or her hired lawyer. Diane frowned, a line of confusion creasing her forehead. "Sole trustee? I am the sole beneficiary, Harlan. My father drafted his will 15 years ago. I am his only surviving child." I reached into the envelope. I pulled out the first stack of papers. They were thick, heavy sheets bearing the red county certification stamp at the bottom of every page. I dropped the irrevocable trust documents onto the polished wood. The sound was a sharp, solid smack, cutting through Diane's rising panic. "That is not a will," I said, my voice dropping into the flat, clinical register I use during compliance audits. "That is a living, irrevocable trust." Harrison bypassed the probate court entirely. He transferred ownership of the farm, the equipment, the water rights, and all liquid capital into this trust 3 days before he died. Diane's hand froze halfway toward her bourbon glass. I tapped the top page, pointing to the bold black text near the seal. "I am the sole beneficiary." I continued spelling out the reality with forensic precision. "I am the sole trustee. The second Harrison's heart stopped beating, every single asset he owned transferred directly to me. There is no public filing. There is no legal avenue for you to contest the transition. You are completely and permanently disinherited, Diane." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum. Diane's sleazy attorney leaned forward, squinting at the red county stamp visible on the trust document. He recognized the formatting immediately. He knew an airtight trust when he saw one. He slowly pulled his hands back from the table, resting them in his lap. "This is absurd," Diane whispered, her voice shaking. "This is a fabrication." He was confused. "You manipulated a dying old man to steal my inheritance." Harrison drove himself to the county clerk's office. Harlan interjected his tone, mild but devastatingly firm. He executed the transfer in front of 3 impartial witnesses and a licensed medical professional who certified his cognitive capacity. "The trust is impenetrable, Diane. You do not own a single blade of grass on this property." Diane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The grand illusion she had built her luxury subdivision, her status, her future wealth, evaporated into thin air, leaving her sitting in a dining room she was legally trespassing in. I did not give her time to recover. A proper audit does not allow the target to catch their breath. I reached back into the envelope. I pulled out the second stack of papers. These were not legal estate transfers. These were raw telecom routing logs and IP address geolocation reports. I dropped the police report and the digital signature logs right next to the trust documents. I shifted my focus entirely to Julian. He was staring at the trust papers, realizing his massive payout from the farm sale had just vanished. He looked up at me, the false confidence completely drained from his face. "You assumed I was distracted, Julian?" I said, my voice cold and even. "You assumed a woman mourning a broken engagement would ignore her credit monitoring alerts?" Julian's face lost all color. He looked at the telecom logs, recognizing the phone numbers printed in the center column. "Last week, you submitted an application for a $50,000 home equity line of credit against my townhouse," I explained, presenting the facts to the entire room. "You logged into my mobile provider account. You forwarded my incoming calls to a prepaid burner phone. You intercepted the bank's verification procedure while I was delivering a keynote speech in Chicago. Then you forged my digital signature to authorize the draw." Julian pushed his chair back slightly, the wooden legs scraping against the floorboards. "Victoria," he stammered, his voice cracking, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Wait, you are misunderstanding the timeline. I was just trying to secure a bridge loan. I was going to pay it back the second Diane sold the farm." Diane whipped her head toward Julian, staring at him in horror. She realized he was attempting to leverage my house based on the assumption of her wealth. "You didn't just break my heart, Julian," I said, cutting off his pathetic defense. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "You committed a federal felony." I tapped the police report. "This is an active case number," I said. "Detective Miller at the Central Precinct processed the warrants yesterday. The bank has locked the application under a hard fraud freeze. The local district attorney is currently reviewing the telecom intercepts to formalize the indictment for wire fraud and identity theft." The sleazy real estate attorney seated next to Diane moved with astonishing speed. He snapped his battered leather briefcase shut. He did not say a word. He physically pushed his chair back from the mahogany table, stood up, and walked rapidly toward the front door. He wanted zero proximity to an active federal wire fraud investigation. The front door clicked shut behind him, signaling the total abandonment of Diane's legal strategy. Julian looked at the empty chair where his ally had been sitting. Panic, a raw, animalistic terror settled into his features. He looked at Harper, desperate for an anchor. Harper burst into tears. It was not the theatrical performance she deployed at the engagement party or the funeral reception. These were genuine, jagged sobs of terror. She realized the stable environment she had engineered was actively collapsing into a criminal indictment. She stood up, clutching her stomach, her face flushed red. He only did it for the baby. Harper cried, her voice echoing shrilly in the dining room. "He just wanted to make sure we had enough money for the nursery and the hospital bills. He was stressed, Victoria. He made a mistake because he was trying to provide for his family. You cannot send the father of my child to prison over a misunderstanding." She was deploying the ultimate shield, attempting to use her pregnancy to demand immunity for a federal crime. She wanted me to view the forgery as an act of desperate paternal love. I looked at Harper, watching the tears stream down her face. I reached into the manila envelope one final time. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed banking ledger containing a sequence of highlighted routing numbers. The single sheet of paper landed softly against the heavy wood. It did not carry the official weight of a Red County stamp or the clinical authority of a police report. It was a simple, unadorned bank ledger detailing a chronological sequence of wire transfers. I had spent hours analyzing the digital breadcrumbs Julian left behind when he attempted to route the fraudulent $50,000 equity draw into an external account. Harper was still crying, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand, demanding immunity for a man she believed acted out of misguided paternal desperation. "He didn't do it for the baby, Harper," I said. My voice sliced through her sobbing, commanding the immediate attention of the room. I pointed to the printed ledger, tracing the sequence of numbers with my index finger. I initiated a trace on the destination routing number listed on the fraudulent loan application, I explained. The funds were not slated for a joint checking account. They were not directed toward a local mortgage lender or a contractor hired to build a nursery. Julianne's face went completely slack. The final protective layer of his deception, the illusion that he was a flawed but devoted family man, disintegrated. The $50,000 was targeted for an offshore cryptocurrency exchange, I said, presenting the stark reality to the table. Julian has been executing highly leveraged day trades using a margin account for the past 6 months. He has been chasing volatility, attempting to cover his accelerating losses. I looked directly at Julian, holding his panicked gaze. Your portfolio imploded 2 weeks ago, I continued, stating the facts with the rhythmic certainty of a metronome. You received a margin call. The brokerage demanded an immediate cash infusion to cover the deficit. You needed $50,000 to prevent them from liquidating your remaining positions and dragging you into personal bankruptcy. I turned my attention back to Harper. The tears had stopped flowing. She was staring at Julianne, her mouth slightly open, struggling to process the structural collapse of her romantic narrative. He never loved you, Harper, I said. The words were not delivered with cruelty, but with the necessary force of a scalpel exposing an infection. You were an acquisition. He realized I was beginning to audit the joint accounts. He knew I was getting too close to discovering his financial rot. He needed a softer target. He needed an easily manipulated backup, ATM. You offered him a fast track to Diane's anticipated inheritance, and you offered him a convenient excuse to remain anchored in Lexington while he executed the wire fraud against my townhouse. The silence in the dining room shattered. The detonation was not physical, but it possessed the same destructive velocity. The carefully constructed alliance between the three of them, the toxic solidarity built entirely on my targeted exploitation, ruptured violently. Julian sprang from his chair, pointing an accusing finger at Harper. "This is your fault," Julian shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure of the impending criminal indictment. "You told me the farm was guaranteed. You told me Diane controlled the estate. If you had not pressured me to buy that massive house in the suburbs, I would never have submitted the loan application. You demanded the lifestyle, Harper. You pushed me into this corner." Harper recoiled as if she had been physically struck. The illusion of her safe harbor shattered instantly. She turned on him, her voice rising into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You lied to me," Harper screamed, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "You told me you were building a future for us. You used my pregnancy as a shield while you gambled our money away on the internet. You are a coward. You are going to federal prison, Julian, and you are leaving me with nothing." While the two of them consumed each other in a chaotic crossfire of accusations and terror, I watched Diane. Diane was sitting rigidly in her chair, staring blankly at the irrevocable trust documents resting in the center of the table. The magnitude of her specific disaster was slowly crystallizing in her mind. She was not facing prison time for wire fraud like Julian. She was facing something far more devastating to her carefully curated country club existence. She was facing absolute financial ruin. Diane had spent the past 2 weeks operating under the assumption of immense wealth. She had bragged to the country club board. She had promised Harper a down payment on a suburban mansion. She had authorized premium services at a high-end funeral parlor, assuming the estate would blindly cover the invoice. I watched the realization hit her. The phantom money had vanished, leaving her holding the physical debt. Diane stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. She pointed a trembling finger at Julian. "Get out of my sight," Diane demanded, her voice shaking with a potent mixture of rage and terror. "You are a parasitic criminal. You ruined my daughter's life. You dragged this family into a federal investigation. I will not have my reputation associated with a felon. Get out of this house." She was attempting to salvage her authority, trying to dictate terms in a room she did not control. She was trying to cast Julian as the sole architect of the disaster, conveniently ignoring her own role in orchestrating the initial betrayal at the engagement party. She turned to me, her face pale, her pearls trembling against her collarbone. "Victoria," Diane said, her tone adopting a desperate, frantic negotiating rhythm. "We need to handle this quietly. We cannot allow this to become a public scandal. I will help you pursue the charges against Julian. I will testify on your behalf. But we need to address the estate. I authorized a $15,000 invoice for the casket and the catering at the funeral home yesterday. The director forwarded the bill to Harlan. You need to release those funds immediately to prevent a default. She was still trying to extract capital. She was staring at a fortified vault and asking me to slide cash under the door to protect her social standing. I looked at Diane, feeling a profound sense of closure. The emotional hooks that had tethered me to her approval for 32 years finally snapped. I did not owe her a screaming match. I did not owe her an explanation. I owed her the exact consequence of her own arrogance. I glanced down at Diane's wrist. The heavy, custom-engraved charm bracelet caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. The word Grandma gleamed brightly against her skin. I do not authorize payments for services I did not request, I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute calm. You assumed the debt, Diane. You signed the authorization forms. The funeral parlor will expect payment in full by the end of the billing cycle. Diane's eyes widened, the panic finally breaking through her polished exterior. I do not have liquid cash to cover a $15,000 invoice, Diane whispered, the admission costing her every ounce of her pride. The country club dues drained my personal accounts. I was relying on the estate transition. I smiled. It was a cold, brief expression. I pointed toward the silver charm dangling from her wrist. You will probably get a few $1,000s for that custom bracelet at the pawn shop down on Main Street, I noted casually. The silver weight is substantial. That should cover your first month's rent when you inevitably have to downsize. Diane gasped, bringing her hand up to cover the bracelet, a gesture of pure defensive shock. She looked around the dining room, searching for an ally, searching for an enabler, searching for anyone to validate her victimhood. She found a room occupied by a weeping daughter, a terrified felon, and a silent attorney. The pack had consumed itself. I stood up. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table, grounding myself in the physical reality of the property I now owned, free and clear. I looked at the three of them, my gaze sweeping over the wreckage of their toxic alliance. My voice carried the unyielding, absolute authority of the landowner. You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my property. They did not argue. My 5-minute ultimatum hung in the air, a physical barrier they could not breach. The forensic slaughter was finished, leaving them with 0 leverage and 0 capital to negotiate a surrender. Julian moved first. He did not look at Harper or Diane. He turned on his heel and walked rapidly out of the dining room, his footsteps heavy and uneven against the hardwood floor. He was a man running from a federal indictment, grasping at the fading illusion of his freedom. The front door opened and shut with a hollow thud. Harper lingered for a fraction of a second. She looked at the mahogany table, at the trust documents and the police report. She opened her mouth, perhaps to attempt one final plea for sanctuary, but she found no safe harbor in my eyes. I stood at the head of the table, perfectly still. Harper swallowed hard, turned, and hurried after Julian, her maternity dress swishing against the doorframe. Diane was the last to leave. She stood frozen, staring at the empty chairs. The country club matriarch had been reduced to a trespasser on her own father's land. She looked down at her wrist, touching the silver charm bracelet. She did not say a single word to me. The silence was her final concession, her ultimate defeat. She picked up her designer handbag, her movements stiff and mechanical, and walked out of the room. Her heels clicked against the floorboards, a slow, defeated rhythm that faded as she exited the house. I followed them at a deliberate distance. I walked out onto the wraparound porch, stepping into the bright afternoon sunlight. I watched them navigate the gravel driveway. Julian had already started his silver sedan, the engine revving high as he threw it into reverse. He backed up recklessly, spraying loose stones across the grass before shifting into drive and speeding toward the county road. He left Harper standing near Diane's car. Harper was sobbing again, pulling at the passenger door handle of Diane's vehicle. Diane unlocked the car, her face a mask of pale shock. They climbed inside the luxury vehicle, a shrinking vessel of their former status. The engine engaged, and the car rolled slowly down the long path, following the dust trail Julian left behind. I stepped off the porch and walked down the driveway. I took my time, feeling the solid ground beneath my boots. The air smelled of sweetgrass and warm earth. I reached the end of the property line where the long wooden fence met the main road. 2 heavy iron gates stood open, anchored to thick stone pillars. I grabbed the wrought iron bars of the left gate and pushed it forward. The metal hinges groaned a deep, resonant sound of closure. I pulled the right gate to meet it in the center. I retrieved the heavy brass padlock hanging from the chain, slid the shackle through the metal loops, and pushed it closed. The mechanism secured with a sharp, definitive click. I stood at the boundary line, watching Diane's car disappear into the heat shimmer on the horizon. I did not feel a trace of guilt. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the pure, clean weight of freedom. The perimeter was secure. 6 months passed. The transition from the stifling heat of summer into the crisp quiet of the Kentucky winter brought a profound sense of order to my life. Justice, unlike the chaotic drama of my former family, moves with a steady, unyielding cadence. Julian never painted a nursery in the townhouse. Detective Miller executed the arrest warrant 3 days after the meeting in the dining room. Law enforcement apprehended him at his downtown corporate office, confiscating his laptop and his mobile devices in front of his colleagues. The digital footprint he left behind was a clear roadmap of federal offenses. He is currently out on bail, awaiting his trial for bank fraud and identity theft. His defense attorney drained the last of his legitimate savings. Julian is living in a cheap motel off the interstate, a transient space reeking of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. He spends his days calculating the likelihood of a plea deal, knowing the offshore cryptocurrency exchange absorbed the funds he planned to use for his legal defense. Diane and Harper did not fare much better under the crushing weight of their own debt. The funeral parlor did exactly what I predicted. When the $15,000 invoice bounced back from Harlan Pratt, they transferred the account to a predatory collection agency. Diane was forced to liquidate her remaining assets to avoid a public lawsuit. She sold her country club membership, enduring the whispered gossip of her former peers. She sold her luxury sedan. She walked into a pawn shop on Main Street and surrendered the custom silver charm bracelet for a fraction of its retail value, just to cover her immediate liabilities. They could no longer afford the mortgage on the suburban mansion. They packed their belongings and rented a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a crowded complex on the edge of the city. Harper gave birth to a healthy baby boy, but the environment is far from the serene aesthetic she envisioned. I hear updates through the local grapevine. The apartment is a claustrophobic pressure cooker. Diane resents Harper for anchoring her to a disgraced felon, and Harper blames Diane for losing the generational wealth. 2 narcissists confined to a tiny space, drowning in debt, with no external host left to feed on. They consume each other in a relentless cycle of bickering and blame. Meanwhile, the horse farm is thriving. I resigned from the corporate auditing firm, leaving the windowless conference rooms behind. I applied my compliance skills to the agricultural ledger, streamlining the operational budget and expanding the boarding facilities. Elias, the working foreman, stayed on, serving as my primary mentor, navigating the complex rhythms of equine management. The property is no longer a silent, isolated fortress. It is a vibrant ecosystem. The neighboring farm owners share resources and trade equipment. We host community dinners on the wraparound porch. Harlan Pratt visits on the first Sunday of every month, bringing legal updates and fresh pastries from the local bakery. I am surrounded by people who do not view my capabilities as an invitation for extraction. They offer their hands when a fence needs repairing, and they offer their time when the workload grows heavy. They are a chosen family that actually shows up. It is a Tuesday morning in late November. The sun is just cresting over the tree line, painting the frost-covered pastures in a pale golden light. The horses are clustered near the feed troughs, their breath pluming in the frigid air. I am standing on the porch wearing a thick wool sweater and my grandfather's faded canvas work jacket. The fabric is soft, familiar, and worn perfectly to the shape of my shoulders. I am holding a ceramic coffee mug. It is the same chipped mug Harrison used every single morning for 20 years. The dark roast coffee warms my palms, radiating a steady, comforting heat. I look out over the 150 acres of bluegrass. The land is quiet, deliberate, and honest. It requires hard work, but it returns exactly what you put into it. It does not lie. It does not manipulate. For 32 years, I believed being the strong one meant serving as a silent foundation for other people to stand on. I allowed a title to function as a cage. I paid the bills, I balanced the ledgers, and I absorbed the betrayals because I believed shared genetics demanded endless compromise. I take a slow sip of the black coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the present moment. I finally understand the lesson my grandfather secured for me. Blood makes you relatives, but behavior makes you family. True strength is not defined by how much abuse you can endure in silence. True strength is the quiet, unyielding courage required to close the gate, lock the padlock, and walk away from anyone who decides your value is determined by your utility. The strong one finally stopped paying for everyone else's choices, and the life I bought back is worth every single penny. When we stand back and survey the wreckage of the Moore family, the shattered engagement, the federal indictments, the bitter exile of a mother and daughter to a cramped apartment, it is easy to focus solely on the climax of the betrayal. It is easy to look at Julian's forged signatures or Harper's stolen fiancé and see a story strictly about greed. But if we dig beneath the surface, past the police reports and the irrevocable trusts, Victoria's journey reveals a much quieter, far more pervasive tragedy. It is a story about the profound failure of parenting. At its core, this narrative forces us to examine the dangerous ways we assign value to our children within the traditional American family structure. In our culture, independence is often held up as the ultimate virtue. We praise the child who ties their own shoes early, the teenager who works 2 jobs to pay for college, the young adult who buys their own home. But there is a dark side to this admiration, when it is practiced without emotional awareness. For parents like Diane, a child's independence is not a trait to be nurtured, it is a convenience to be exploited. Diane did not raise 2 daughters. She cultivated a host and a parasite. From a young age, Victoria was handed the label of the strong one. In a healthy family, strength is a resource used to navigate the outside world. In the Moore family, Victoria's strength was weaponized against her, used as an excuse to deny her the grace and support that every child fundamentally deserves. Harper, conversely, was cast as the delicate one, the child whose missteps were constantly buffered by the family's collective resources. This dynamic highlights a critical failure in family responsibility. True parenting requires a foundation of fairness and honesty. It demands that a parent look at their children as equal individuals, not as opposing tools designed to balance a household's aesthetic. By refusing to hold Harper accountable for her choices, whether it was maxing out credit cards or blowing up a sibling's engagement, Diane taught her younger daughter that love is synonymous with immunity. She taught Harper that the rules of basic human decency did not apply to her so long as there was a strong one available to absorb the collateral damage. This approach to child rearing does not produce happy, well-adjusted adults. It produces adults who view the people around them as instruments for their own comfort. When we look at Julian and Harper's attempt to steal Victoria's townhouse, we are not just looking at a crime. We are looking at the natural, inevitable endpoint of Diane's parenting model. When you teach a child that they are entitled to someone else's harvest, you raise a person capable of smiling in a maternity dress while destroying their sister's life. Contrast this toxic dynamic with the quiet, enduring guidance of Grandfather Harrison. Harrison represented a different era of American values, one rooted in the unyielding reality of the soil. He understood that a family legacy is not built on country club memberships or charm bracelets. It is built on accountability, labor, and truth. Land, as Harrison knew, does not care about your excuses. If you do not mend the fence, the horses run. If you do not plant the seed, you do not eat. Harrison provided the long-term guidance that Diane actively dismantled. He watched Victoria carry the financial and emotional weight of her mother and sister for decades. He did not step in with empty platitudes or demand that she be the bigger person. Instead, he used the final days of his life to teach her the most important lesson a parent figure can impart. You are allowed to protect yourself. By executing the irrevocable trust, Harrison did more than hand over 150 acres of prime Kentucky bluegrass. He handed Victoria the permission to draw a line in the sand. He demonstrated that true family responsibility sometimes means cutting off the diseased branch to save the rest of the tree. Raising children with emotional awareness means teaching them that their actions carry weight. It means instilling the belief that blood relations do not grant anyone a free pass to commit emotional or financial abuse. A traditional family should be a sanctuary, a place of mutual respect and reciprocal care. When that sanctuary is corrupted by favoritism and extraction, the healthiest, most courageous choice a person can make is to walk out the door and build a new table. Victoria's ultimate triumph was not merely securing her financial assets. Her true victory was achieving the clarity to recognize the role she had been forced to play and finding the quiet, unshakable strength to resign from the cast. She broke a generational curse of enabling and entitlement. In doing so, she cleared the ground to cultivate a chosen family, a network of neighbors, farmhands, and friends who operate on mutual respect rather than parasitic demand. Stories like Victoria's resonate so deeply because they strip away the polite fictions we often tell ourselves about family loyalty. They remind us that the titles we inherit at birth do not dictate the boundaries we are allowed to set in adulthood. If you have ever sat at a holiday dinner and felt the silent, crushing weight of being the reliable one, if you have ever realized that your competence is being used as a substitute for being genuinely loved, then this story is for you. This is exactly why we gather here to share these journeys. We explore the shadows of family dynamics to find the blueprint for our own peace. If Victoria's walk down that long gravel driveway resonated with you, if her quiet refusal to sign away her life sparked a fire in your own chest, take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel Revenge Order. Drop a comment sharing your own experiences with setting boundaries and join a community that understands the true cost of walking away. We will continue bringing you narratives where accountability reigns and quiet courage wins the day. As you go about your evening, take a moment to reflect on the dynamics operating quietly in the background of your own life. Look at the people sitting around your dinner table. Who is constantly pouring the wine, and who is quietly, perpetually paying for it? We are conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, a permanent tether we must endure, regardless of the friction it causes to our own skin. But perhaps the most vital lesson we can learn from a rusted iron gate in the Kentucky hills is that the tether is only as strong as the mutual respect holding it together. When that respect vanishes, the bond ceases to be a relationship. It becomes a debt, and you are always, always allowed to close the ledger.